one golden ticket still floating around somewhere.
Hey, you've got it! You've got the last golden ticket! The kids found the last golden ticket!
You remember the feeling. Sitting cross-legged on the carpet, the glow of the television filling the room, watching a boy named Charlie unwrap a chocolate bar and find gold underneath. That movie became part of your childhood. It became part of everyone's childhood. But the version of Willy Wonka and the chocolate factory that lived inside your memory was never the full story. Behind the candy-colored sets and the sing-along musical numbers, a much darker film was fighting to exist, and the people who made it spent 50 years making sure you never noticed. The chocolate factory was built to sell candy that never existed. Every single person who grew up watching this film believed they were watching a story about a magical candy maker and a golden ticket. That belief is not wrong, but it is dangerously incomplete, because the entire reason this movie was made has nothing to do with storytelling, nothing to do with Roald Dahl's novel, and nothing to do with any filmmaker's artistic vision. The movie exists because a cereal company wanted to sell chocolate bars. In the late 1960s, the Quaker Oats Company, a manufacturer of breakfast cereals with zero experience in filmmaking and zero experience in the candy industry, decided they wanted to break into the confectionery market. Producer David Wolper bumped into a Quaker Oats advertising executive by coincidence and pitched an idea that should have been laughed out of the room. Quaker Oats would put up $3 million to fully finance a feature film, and in return, they would own the exclusive rights to manufacture and sell a line of Willy Wonka branded candy bars. The movie was not conceived as entertainment. It was conceived as a 90-minute commercial for a product that had not been manufactured yet. That corporate deal is the reason for the title change that has confused people for over 50 years. Roald Dahl's 1964 novel was called Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Charlie was the heart of the story. But Quaker Oats did not want to sell a candy bar named after a boy called Charlie. They wanted the name Wonka plastered across every wrapper, every shelf, every advertisement. So they demanded the title be changed to Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, and the entire emotional center of the narrative shifted away from the child and on to the candy maker. Dahl was reportedly furious, but he had already signed away total artistic control to the studio, a decision he later called the worst mistake of his professional life. The $3 million budget was painfully small even by 1971 standards, which is why the entire production relocated to Munich, Germany, where filming costs were a fraction of what they would have been in Los Angeles or London. Director Mel Stewart later admitted he chose Munich partly because, in his own words, nobody knows what Munich looks like. That geographic anonymity served a deliberate creative purpose. By filming in a city most audiences could not identify, Stewart ensured that the town in the movie belonged to no recognizable country. The currency does not match any real nation. The accents are a jumble. The street signs are in German, but the characters speak English with American inflections. Stewart wanted the story to feel like it could happen anywhere on Earth. And that rootlessness is why every generation has been able to project itself onto the screen without feeling like an outsider looking in. But the real tragedy of this corporate origin story played out after filming wrapped. Quaker Oats attempted to produce their Thai and Wonka bars in time for the movie's release, and the recipe failed catastrophically. The chocolate melted far too easily, even under normal storage conditions. Quaker Oats had already rebranded their entire candy subsidiary as the Willy Wonka Candy Company in anticipation of a massive product launch, and every bit of that infrastructure became worthless overnight. The bars were recalled almost immediately. The candy line collapsed. The product the entire movie had been built to promote never reached audiences in any meaningful way. Paramount Pictures handled the theatrical release in June of 1971, and the box office returns were deeply disappointing. The film earned roughly $4 million against its $3 million budget, a result the industry considered a failure. Quaker Oats walked away from the project. Paramount let their distribution rights expire without a fight. The 90-minute chocolate bar commercial was now an orphan, abandoned by every corporation that had originally funded its creation. The reason it survived has everything to do with what happened next, when the author who created the source material tried to destroy the movie from the inside. The author who disowned the film. Most people carry this movie in their hearts like a warm blanket from childhood. Roald Dahl carried it like a wound. The man who created Charlie Bucket, who invented the chocolate factory, who dreamed up the golden tickets and the Oompa Loompas and the glass elevator, spent the final 19 years of his life refusing to speak a single kind word about the film that made his story immortal. And the depth of his fury was not irrational. From his perspective, every meaningful thing about his creation had been stripped away, rewritten, and handed to strangers. The conflict started long before cameras rolled. Dahl was paid $300,000 to write the screenplay, and he delivered a first draft that stayed closer to his novel's darker, more dangerous tone. Dahl's version of Wonka was more menacing, more ambiguous, more of a figure you genuinely could not read. But Dahl fell behind schedule, and the studio made a decision that fractured the entire production irreparably. They brought in David Seltzer, a young documentary filmmaker who had never written a feature screenplay in his life, to perform an uncredited rewrite. Seltzer himself later admitted in the documentary Pure Imagination that he had little idea what he was doing when he arrived on set in Munich. But the changes Seltzer made rewired the story at a molecular level. He expanded the character of Slugworth, the sinister candy rival who corners each child with a whispered deal after they find their golden ticket. Slugworth does not exist anywhere in Dahl's novel. He is entirely a product of the film's rewrite. Seltzer also created the Gobstopper subplot, the moral test that ultimately determines whether Charlie deserves to inherit the factory. He rewrote the ending. He softened the tone in ways that made Dahl feel physically ill. Dahl's casting preferences were overruled completely. He wanted British comedian Spike Milligan for Wonka, envisioning a more unpredictable and sinister interpretation. When Milligan was unavailable, Dahl pushed for Peter Sellers, who actually called Dahl personally to beg for the part. But the casting decision was no longer in Dahl's hands. The studio chose Gene Wilder, and Dahl was openly disgusted. He called Wilder pretentious and bouncy, insisting the actor brought entirely the wrong energy to a character who was supposed to feel genuinely threatening. Dahl tried to have specific musical numbers removed from the final cut. He particularly despised the Candyman, calling the film's songs sappy and overly sentimental. He described director Mel Stewart as having no talent or flair whatsoever. He called the finished movie crummy. He publicly disowned it, and he took one final act of retribution that shaped the franchise for decades. He refused to allow any sequel to be produced during his lifetime, permanently killing the possibility of adapting Charlie and the Great Glass Elevator. Dahl died in 1990, his anger intact. His widow later gave her blessing to Tim Burton's 2005 version, saying she believed her husband would have approved. And yet, something painfully ironic sits at the center of this whole war. The element Dahl hated most, the Slugworth temptation and Charlie's Gobstopper return, was the exact addition that elevated a whimsical candy story into something that examines what human beings actually do when they think nobody is watching. Without Seltzer's rewrite, the film would have ended with the word yippee as the elevator rose. There would have been no test of character, no moral reckoning, no final proof of worthiness. The thing the author despised most about the adaptation was the thing that gave his story a soul. The studio did not just rewrite the plot, though. They erased something from the original source material that was far more troubling, and the controversy it generated goes back to the very first edition of Dahl's book. The racial controversy that was quietly painted over. For most people, the Oompa Loompas are a purely nostalgic image. Little orange-skinned, green-haired figures singing morality songs after each child's downfall. That memory feels safe and familiar, which is exactly why the truth behind their original depiction is so jarring. In Roald Dahl's 1964 first edition of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, the Oompa Loompas were not fantasy creatures. They were described explicitly as a tribe of African pygmy people, from, in Dahl's own words, the very deepest and darkest part of the African jungle, where no white man had ever been before. Wonka explains in the book that he discovered them living in near starvation, surviving on vile caterpillars, and transported them to his factory in large packing cases with holes in them. They work for him in exchange for cacao beans. They are depicted as small, dark-skinned, simple people who worship the white factory owner as a kind of savior figure. The parallels to the transatlantic slave trade and colonial exploitation were visible on the surface to anyone who cared to look, but for years, almost nobody challenged them publicly. That changed when the 1971 film went into production. The NAACP raised formal objections and called for significant changes. The filmmakers understood that putting Dahl's original depiction on screen would be indefensible, so they redesigned the characters from the ground up. The Oompa Loompas became fantasy creatures with bright orange skin and green hair, from the fictional territory of Loompaland rather than Africa. The film's version of Wonka describes bringing them to his factory for their own peace and safety, far from the dangerous beasts of their homeland. The open references to African pygmies were erased, but the underlying structure remained intact. A wealthy white factory owner still transports an entire population of smaller, voiceless workers to labor in his facility, singing and performing at his command, with no visible compensation beyond survival. Dahl himself resisted revising his book for years. He finally conceded in a 1973 revised edition where the Oompa Loompas became small, rosy-cheeked, long-haired figures with white skin. Their origin was relocated from Africa to the fictional island of Loompaland. Dahl addressed the criticism directly in a 1988 interview, saying it had not occurred to him that his depiction was racist, but after listening to the NAACP and others, he found himself sympathizing with their concerns, which is why he agreed to make changes. The controversy did not end with the revised book or the redesigned film characters. Scholars and critics have continued to examine the power dynamics embedded in the Oompa Loompa concept across all adaptations. Tim Burton's 2005 version cast Deep Roy, a British actor of Kenyan Indian descent, to play every single Oompa Loompa through digital duplication.
I have last time I worked was on a television, Eastbound and Down, Star Trek. I did Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. I just finished a short feature which is called Ballad of Sandy.
And that decision generated its own wave of uncomfortable discussion. The 2023 prequel Wonka sidestepped the issue almost entirely by casting Hugh Grant as a single Oompa Loompa, reducing the labor force to one comedic character. What the 1971 film painted over was genuinely disturbing, and the fact that the cleaned-up version still carries echoes of those original dynamics tells you something about how deeply those ideas were woven into the foundation of the story. But the racial erasure was not the only darkness hiding inside this production. The most terrifying moments in the finished film were not planned, were not scripted, and left multiple cast members believing that Gene Wilder had genuinely lost his grip on reality. The scene that traumatized the cast. Everyone who has ever watched Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory carries a specific memory of the tunnel scene. You probably watched it as a child with your hands half covering your eyes, not fully understanding why you felt so uneasy, but knowing deep in your chest that something was wrong. The moment the riverboat enters the darkened passage, the warm nostalgia of the previous hour evaporates completely, and something else takes its place. Strobing psychedelic lights in sickening reds, blues, and purples wash across the tunnel walls. Disturbing images flash in rapid succession, including footage of a centipede crawling across a human face, a chicken being decapitated, a lizard consuming smaller prey, and close-up shots of writhing insects. The images cut so rapidly that the brain absorbs them before the conscious mind has time to process what it just saw, a technique more commonly associated with psychological thrillers than anything intended for children. And then Gene Wilder begins reciting a poem that sounds nothing like the playful candy-maker audiences had been watching for the previous hour. His voice rises steadily. His eyes widen with an expression that crosses the line from eccentric into something that feels genuinely unhinged. The recitation builds in intensity until the entire boat seems to be hurtling toward a destination that cannot possibly end well. None of it was in the script, and the cast had no idea it was coming. Director Mel Stuart deliberately chose not to warn the child actors or most of the adult performers about what was going to happen during that sequence. He wanted authentic fear on camera, and he got exactly that. Peter Ostrom, who played Charlie, later described the experience as genuinely terrifying. Denise Nickerson, who played Violet Beauregard, gave one of the most revealing accounts in a later interview. She said there was no acting involved whatsoever in her reaction. Her jaw dropped to the ground and never came back up. She said Wilder's outburst was not in the script, and she was completely speechless. Her assessment of the moment was brutally honest. She thought nobody would come to see the movie because the character was, in her words, a nut job. Jack Albertson, the veteran actor playing Grandpa Joe, was equally shaken. The Oompa Loompa extra assigned to steer the boat had been told by Stewart that he was actually controlling the vessel, when in reality it was running on a hidden track the entire time. When the tunnel went dark, this performer genuinely panicked because he believed he was responsible for the safety of everyone on board and could not see where they were going. Julie Dawn Cole, who played Verica Salt, confirmed in multiple interviews over the years that the cast never knew what to expect from Wilder on any given shooting day. She described him as speaking in a soft whisper off camera, with nothing ever ruffling his composure. And then, without any warning at all, he would erupt into a performance that left everyone around him unsure whether they were watching acting or witnessing something real. The Chocolate River itself carried its own behind-the-scenes horror. It was made from real water, chocolate, and cream mixed with food coloring. After filming Wrapped, the mixture turned rancid within days, creating a vile smell that permeated the entire soundstage at Bavaria Studios and lingered long after the crew had moved on. The set that looked like paradise on screen became unbearable in person, almost immediately. Stewart's commitment to capturing authentic reactions extended beyond the tunnel. He also chose not to warn Peter Ostrom about the climactic office scene where Wonka screams at Charlie and Grandpa Joe, telling them they get nothing, that they lose, and demanding they leave immediately. Ostrom's devastated, tearful reaction in that scene is entirely real. Gene Wilder himself reportedly asked Stewart to warn the 12-year-old beforehand, but Stewart refused. He wanted the shock, and the cost of capturing it was a child actor who was genuinely heartbroken in the moment. Stewart had weaponized the trust between his cast and his leading man. And the reason he could do it was because of a single decision Gene Wilder had made before he ever agreed to appear in the film at all. The 30 seconds that rewired every scene in the movie. Gene Wilder agreed to play Willy Wonka under one absolute condition. If the condition was refused, he would walk away from the production entirely. The demand had nothing to do with salary, nothing to do with billing, nothing to do with screen time. Wilder wanted to create Wonka's very first entrance himself.
Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory from 1971, people who shorten the title when talking about it would simply call it Charlie, and that was too vague for their liking. Meanwhile, there could be no confusion what Willy Wonka was referring to.
He told director Mel Stuart that he wanted to walk out of the factory gates limping badly, leaning on a cane, looking frail and old and broken. The crowd would watch in horrified silence. Then, the cane would catch in the cobblestones. Wonka would pitch forward into what looked like a catastrophic fall, and at the last possible moment, the fall would transform into a perfect forward somersault, and Wonka would spring up grinning, with his arms spread wide. Stewart was confused. He asked why Wilder would want to do something like that. Wilder's answer, given first to Stewart on that day and repeated later in a 2002 interview with Larry King, and again in the documentary Pure Imagination, is the single most important piece of creative thinking in the entire production. He said, "Because from that time on, no one will know if I'm lying or telling the truth." Stewart asked if Wilder was truly willing to turn down the role over this single moment. Wilder confirmed he was, and he meant it. Stewart agreed. Wilder trained with 2 professional stuntmen to perfect the somersault. That 30-second scene, nowhere in Dahl's book and nowhere in the original screenplay, fundamentally altered every single moment that follows it in the film. Every warning Wonka delivers, every soft-spoken "no, stop, don't" as a child approaches danger, every quiet smile as a child disappears, all of it becomes impossible to read with certainty. You can never tell whether Wonka is genuinely trying to protect the children or whether he is calmly watching a test unfold exactly as he designed it. That ambiguity is not an accident. It is the entire performance, and it was built on a single creative demand from an actor who understood the character more deeply than the director, the screenwriter, or even the author who created him. Julie Dawn Cole confirmed that this unpredictability ran through every day on set. Denise Nickerson described Wilder as kind and gentle between takes, a man who spoke in whispers and whose composure was nearly impossible to crack. And then the camera would roll, and the person standing in front of them would become someone else entirely, someone whose motivations could never be fully understood from the outside. Wilder had built a character that the audience could never fully trust, and the disturbing power of every dark scene in the film depends entirely on that trust being broken in the very first frame. Without those 30 seconds, the tunnel scene is just weird. The screaming office scene is just mean. The children's eliminations are just unfortunate. With those 30 seconds in place, every one of those moments carries a weight that no screenplay could have created on paper. And the film's single most famous line, the one that crystallized everything Wilder had been building toward for the entire runtime, almost did not exist at all. The ending scribbled in 3 minutes on a phone. The original ending of the movie followed Dahl's book faithfully. The glass elevator rises through the factory roof into the sky. Grandpa Joe shouts the word "Yippee." The credits roll. Director Mel Stewart knew immediately that it was a dead ending for a feature film. The problem was that screenwriter David Seltzer had already left the production, physically and mentally depleted from weeks of sleepless rewriting in Munich. He had retreated to a tiny cabin in the Maine woods to recover. In that remote stretch of forest, there was no telephone, except a single payphone that had been literally nailed to a tree. Nobody was usually around to answer it. But early one morning, Seltzer was walking down to the lake to go fishing, and the phone started ringing. He picked it up. Mel Stewart was on the other end, calling from Munich, and his message was blunt. They did not have an ending. The original finale was flat. Stewart told Seltzer that they were standing on a set that cost $30,000 an hour, and he needed a solution immediately. Seltzer described what happened next in an NPR interview years later. He walked down to the lake. He looked out over the still water. His head was completely removed from the world of the movie. He could barely remember the plot. And then he asked himself the simplest possible question. How do fairy tales end? They end with, "They all lived happily ever after." That was the answer. But it was also a cliché that no screenwriter would ever put in a final draft. So Seltzer took the cliché and inverted it. He walked back to the phone and told Stewart to listen carefully. Wonka announces that the factory now belongs to Charlie. Then Wonka pauses and tells Charlie, in a cautious and measured voice, not to forget what happened to the boy who suddenly got everything he always wanted. Fear crosses Charlie's face. He asks what happened, and Wonka delivers the line that has been quoted for over 50 years. He lived happily ever after. There was a long pause on the line. Seltzer was convinced his career was finished. Then Stewart said one word, "Fantastic," and that was it. That became the ending of the movie. Written in roughly 3 minutes on a payphone nailed to a tree by a screenwriter who could barely recall the story he was finishing. And it became one of the most celebrated closing lines in the history of cinema. Because it does something no other moment in the film does. It reframes the entire factory not as a reward, but as a burden, a responsibility, a weight that Wonka has been carrying alone for years and is now passing to a child. The prize is not chocolate. The prize is the hardest test of all. The test of what you do after you get everything you ever wanted, when nobody is watching anymore. Dahl never publicly commented on that specific line, even though he condemned nearly everything else Seltzer contributed. The ending he spent years despising was the ending that made generations of viewers cry, and the silence he kept around it says more than any criticism ever could. The boy who chose a different kind of life. Peter Ostrom was 12 years old when he was cast as Charlie Bucket. He had never been on a film set before. He was spotted by talent agents while performing in a children's theater production at the Cleveland Playhouse in Ohio. At the time of his audition, the screenplay did not even exist yet. The studio handed him the novel and asked him to read from it. During filming in Munich, Ostrom formed a bond with Gene Wilder that shaped his memory of the entire experience. Every day at lunch, Wilder would sit with the boy and share a chocolate bar with him. Ostrom later compared losing Wilder, who died in 2016 from complications of Alzheimer's disease, to losing a parent.
Wilder was a genius comic actor and a very talented writer, director, and producer. We begin with the death of Gene Wilder. News of his passing and an occasion to remember how much he made us laugh.
He told Variety that Wilder was the professional and he was the rookie, and that everything he understood about the weight of a performance came from watching Wilder work. After the film wrapped, Ostrom was offered a 3-picture contract that would have launched a traditional Hollywood career. He turned it down. At 12 years old, he walked away from the film industry entirely and never looked back. He later said the business simply was not for him. When the movie was released, there was no premiere, no red carpet, no fanfare. Ostrom was back home in Ohio. The reviews were lukewarm. People moved on. And for nearly a decade, it was as though the whole thing had never happened. Then, home video changed everything. In the early 1980s, Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory began airing repeatedly on television and entered the rental market on VHS. A film that every studio and sponsor had written off as a commercial failure quietly became one of the most watched and rewatched family movies ever made. By 2003, Entertainment Weekly ranked it 25th on their list of the top 50 cult films of all time. Children discovered it not in theaters, but on living room floors, on snow days and sick days and Saturday mornings. And it became part of the emotional architecture of growing up in a way that nobody involved in its chaotic production could have predicted. Ostrom, meanwhile, built a completely different life. His family gave him a horse when he was a teenager. And through caring for that animal, he developed a relationship with the local veterinarian. That connection rewired his future. He enrolled at Cornell University College of Veterinary Medicine, earned his doctorate in 1984, and spent nearly 4 decades treating dairy cows, horses, and farm animals at a clinic in upstate New York before retiring in 2023. For most of his adult life, he kept his film career a secret. He did not begin speaking publicly about his time as Charlie Bucket until the 1990s, when the film's growing cult status made anonymity impossible. Every 4.5 years, Ostrom once said, a new generation discovers the film. Children recognize him on the street. Their eyes light up. They see Charlie Bucket, and the man who turned down Hollywood smiles and keeps walking, because he understood something at 12 years old that most people spend a lifetime trying to learn. The version of Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory that lives in your memory, the one that felt like pure magic when you were a child, was born from a failed candy bar scheme, torn apart by a war between author and studio, haunted by a racial controversy that required the complete erasure of the original characters, and held together by performances that were never planned and reactions that were never acted. The nostalgia is real. So is everything that was hidden underneath it. And now that you know, you will never watch it the same way again. Tell us in the comments which of these revelations hit you the hardest, and whether you will ever be able to see this film through the same innocent eyes again.